All right, let's dive into this fascinating world of hand gestures. It's amazing how much we communicate without even realizing it.
Yeah, it really is like a secret language we all speak.
So, you sent over some awesome material by Joe Navarro, this former FBI agent's route. He seems to have cracked the code on nonverbal communication, especially when it comes to hands.
Definitely. He spent years studying this stuff. And what he found is that our hands can be incredibly revealing.
It's like they have a mind of their own sometimes.
Well, in a way they do. You see, our hands are directly connected to the limbic system.
The emotional center of our brain.
Exactly. So while we can try to control our words and facial expressions, our hands often betray our true feelings.
So, like, if I'm nervous in a job interview, my hands might start fidgeting even if I'm trying to appear calm.
Yeah, that's a classic example.
So, what are some of the things we can learn by observing how people use their hands?
Well, one of the most basic things is pacifying behavior.
Pacifying.
Yeah, these are actions we do to soothe ourselves when we're feeling stressed or uncomfortable.
Like when babies suck their thumbs.
Exactly. But adults do it too. It's just that our pacifying behaviors become more subtle as we get older.
So instead of sucking our thumbs, we might rub our necks or play with our jewelry.
Exactly. Or adjust our glasses, twirl our hair, things like that.
It's funny how those little actions can actually be signals of inner turmoil.
They really can.
Is there any way to tell the difference between someone who's just fidgety and someone who's genuinely distressed?
That's where context comes in. You have to look at the whole picture. The person's facial expressions, their posture, the situation they're in.
So if someone is normally very animated, and then suddenly they become still and start using a lot of pacifying behaviors.
That could be a red flag.
Okay, let's talk handshakes. They seem so straightforward, but Navarro suggests there's a lot more to them than meets the eye.
Yeah, he really dives deep into the nuances of handshakes.
Like, is a firm handshake really a sign of confidence?
Well, that's actually a myth. He completely debunks that idea.
Oh, really?
He argues that handshakes are primarily cultural. What's considered appropriate in one culture might be seen as rude or aggressive in another.
So, like, I shouldn't judge someone's personality based on how they shake my hand.
Not necessarily.
Mm,
You have to consider the cultural context. He gives some really interesting examples in his book.
like what?
Well, for instance, he contrasts the quick, light handshake that's common in New Mexico
Okay.
with the more elaborate Mormon handshake in Utah.
Wow. I've never even heard of that.
Both are perfectly normal within their respective cultures.
Mm-hmm.
The point is to be aware of these differences so you don't misinterpret someone's intentions.
I've definitely had some awkward handshake encounters where I wasn't sure what the other person was trying to communicate. So besides cultural differences, are there other subtle things we should look for in handshakes?
Well, one thing he points out is that the way someone initiates a handshake can be revealing.
Oh, interesting. How so?
If they offer their hand with the palm facing slightly upwards, it can signal a more submissive or accommodating attitude. But if their palm is facing down, it can convey a sense of dominance or control.
Wow. I'm going to have to pay attention to that from now on. What about preening? Navarro talks about that as a form of nonverbal communication as well, right?
He does. Preening is basically any action we take to adjust our appearance.
Mm.
And it can reveal a lot about how we feel, about ourselves and the people around us.
So like smoothing down your clothes before a job interview or checking your hair in the mirror.
Exactly.
But he says preening can be a sign of respect or disrespect, depending on the context. How is that possible?
Well, imagine you're having a conversation with someone and they start picking lint off their clothes or filing their nails while you're talking.
Oh, okay.
That can send the message that they're not really engaged
Yeah.
or that they don't value your time.
Right, like they're more focused on themselves than on the interaction.
Exactly. Now, Navarro also talks about hands as illustrators.
Illustrate.
You know, how we use our hands to emphasize our words or paint a picture in the air. They can add a whole other layer of meaning to what we're saying.
Can they contradict our words?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sometimes our hand gestures can completely contradict what we're saying, which is why it's so important to pay attention to those nonverbal cues.
Can you give an example of that? Like how hand gestures might contradict someone's words?
Sure. Let's say someone tells you they're fine, but their hands are clenched into fists, or they're wringing their hands. That's a clear sign that they're not actually fine, despite what they're saying.
Right. Their body language is betraying their true feelings.
Exactly.
So it's like we have this whole other vocabulary we're using without even knowing it.
We do.
Huh.
And the more you understand these nonverbal cues, the better you'll be at interpreting them. in different contexts.
Speaking of context, Navarro also talks about how hand gestures can vary across cultures.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He gives the example of the OK sign,
Mm.
where you make a circle with your thumb and forefinger. In most Western cultures, this means, okay or all good, but in some parts of Europe, it can be considered offensive.
Really?
Yeah. And in Japan, it can symbolize money.
So you could accidentally insult someone with a seemingly harmless hand gesture.
You could.
Yeah.
It's definitely something to be mindful of, especially when you're traveling or interacting with people from different backgrounds.
Yeah, it's fascinating how different cultures can interpret the same gesture in completely different ways.
It just goes to show you really have to pay attention to the context. So what about some of those other hand gestures Navarro highlights? Like the steeple,
Oh yeah, the steeple, that's a classic one.
touching your fingertips together, palms apart. What's the significance of that?
Well, he says it's often seen as a sign of confidence or authority.
So like a CEO
Yeah.
giving a presentation.
Exactly, or a lawyer making a closing argument. You often see it in people who are in leadership positions.
Or people who feel very sure of themselves.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that you can actually use the steeple strategically.
Strategically, if you're in a negotiation or a meeting where you want to project confidence, subtly steepling your fingers can actually help you feel more self-assured.
So you're saying I can use my hands to influence not only how others perceive me, but also how I feel about myself.
There's actually a lot of research to support that idea. Our body language can have a real impact on our thoughts and emotions.
That's pretty powerful. It's like we have this built-in system for boosting our own confidence. What about some of the negative hand gestures?
Negative.
Like Navarro mentions intertwined fingers held rigidly.
Oh, right. Yeah, where the fingers are tightly interlocked.
Is that always a bad sign?
Well, he says it's often a sign of high distress or anxiety.
So like when you're feeling really stressed out.
Yeah. He often saw it in people who were facing difficult situations, like suspects being interrogated or witnesses testifying in court.
So it's like a way of physically holding themselves together under pressure.
Exactly. And it's something you might see in everyday life as well.
Like if someone's having a tough conversation.
Yeah. If you're talking to someone and they suddenly start clasping their hands tightly, it could be a sign that they're feeling uncomfortable or stressed.
So it's like their body is trying to tell you something even if their words aren't.
Exactly. Which is why it's so important to pay attention to these nonverbal cues, both in ourselves and in others.
It seems like our hands are constantly giving us away, even when we think you're in control.
They are.
Yeah.
It can help us communicate more effectively, build stronger relationships, and even navigate challenging situations with more grace.
You know, it's funny. Just thinking about all these hand gestures is making me more aware of my own hands.
Oh, yeah.
I'm suddenly wondering if I steeple too much, or if I use pacifying behaviors without even realizing it.
That's the beauty of learning about this stuff. It makes you more mindful of your own nonverbal communication.
And how it might be impacting your interactions with others.
Absolutely.
You know, we've been focusing so much on hands, but Navarro also talks about how other parts of the body communicate, right?
He does. He talks about the feet, the legs, even the torso.
So it's not just our hands that are talking.
Not at all. Our whole body is involved in nonverbal communication.
So what can we learn by paying attention to these other areas?
What he calls the feet and legs the reliable baseline,
Why is that?
because they tend to be less consciously controlled than our faces or hands.
So they're even harder to fake.
Exactly. Our feet, for example, often reveal our true feelings, even when we're trying to maintain a neutral expression.
So like if someone says they're happy to see me, but their feet are pointed towards the door.
That might be a sign they're actually eager to leave.
Huh. It's like their body is saying, I'm out of here.
You have to look at the whole picture, of course.
Yeah.
But foot direction can be a good indicator of someone's level of engagement.
What about leg crossing? I've always heard that crossing your legs is a sign of being closed off or defensive.
It can be, especially if legs are tightly crossed and held close to the body. But he points out that crossing your legs can also be a sign of comfort and relaxation,
Oh, really?
particularly when you're around people you trust.
So how can you tell the difference?
Well, it's all about observing those subtle differences. For instance, if someone's legs are loosely crossed with their feet dangling, that's probably a sign of ease.
Okay.
But if they suddenly uncross their legs and plant their feet firmly on the ground, it could indicate a shift towards discomfort.
Or even a desire to leave.
Exactly.
So it's like their body language is saying, I'm ready to bolt.
Pretty much.
What about our torsos? How do they play into all of this?
Well, Navarro calls the torso the human billboard
The human billboard.
because it's the part of our body we most often decorate and adorn. We choose clothing that projects a certain image. We wear jewelry that reflects our personality. We even get tattoos that tell a story about who we are.
So it's like we're sending a message to the world through how we present our torsos.
Exactly. And it's often more revealing than we realize.
In what way?
Well, for example, he points out that people tend to perceive others as more honest and trustworthy when their torsos are visible.
Oh, interesting.
Think about it. When someone is hiding their torso behind a podium or hunching over, it can create a sense of distance or distrust.
But when they stand up straight and open up their posture,
It conveys a sense of confidence and authenticity.
makes sense.
Right.
It's amazing how much we communicate without even saying a word.
I know, right?
And we haven't even gotten to the face yet, which is obviously a whole other world of nonverbal cues.
The face is the ultimate canvas of human emotion.
So how do we decipher all those subtle signals?
Well, Navarro spends a lot of time in his work breaking down the different micro-expressions and subtle movements that can reveal our true feelings.
I've heard about microexpressions, this fleeting facial expressions that happen so quickly we often miss them.
Yeah, they can be hard to catch.
Are they something we can actually learn to spot?
With practice, yes. He suggests focusing on the areas around the eyes and mouth, as those tend to be the most expressive.
And what should we be looking for?
Well, he gives the example of smiling eyes.
Smiling eyes.
A genuine smile involves the muscles around the eyes, crinkling them up at the corners. But a fake or forced smile only engages the mouth, leaving the eyes unchanged.
So if someone's eyes aren't smiling, it's a pretty good sign they're not truly happy. Even if their mouth is turned up in a grin.
It's definitely something to consider. You have to look at other cues as well, of course.
Yeah.
But the eyes are often a dead giveaway.
What about other facial expressions? I'm sure there are tons of them.
There are. He talks about how lip compression, where the lips seem to disappear, is often a sign of stress or anxiety.
Oh, okay.
He also mentions that nose touching can be a sign of discomfort or even deception.
But I thought he said that both honest and dishonest people touch their noses.
He did. It's not a foolproof indicator of lying. It's about looking for clusters of behaviors and considering the overall context.
Right, right.
And speaking of the nose, one thing I found fascinating was his observation that we tend to touch or rub our noses more when we're stressed,
Why is that?
because the mucous membranes dry out and the nerves become more sensitive.
Yeah. So it's another one of those pacifying behaviors we talked about earlier.
Precisely.
What about the forehead? I know when I'm stressed, my forehead tends to wrinkle up like an accordion.
That's a common reaction. And because the forehead is such a prominent feature, it's hard to conceal those wrinkles.
So it's a pretty reliable tell.
Yeah, pretty much.
What about the eyes? I mean, we've already talked about smiling eyes.
Right.
But are there other things to look for in someone's eyes?
Oh, there's so many nuances to eye behavior. He talks about how we use our eyes to block out information we don't want to see.
Like if we see something disturbing.
It could be something disturbing, something we disagree with, anything really.
How do we do that with our eyes?
Well, we can literally close our eyes, of course,
Yeah.
but we can also squint or even just blink more rapidly.
I can definitely relate to that. When I hear something I don't like, I find myself blinking a lot, like I'm trying to erase the words.
It's a natural response.
What else?
He also discusses pupil dilation and constriction.
Pupil what?
Dilation and constriction. How our pupils enlarge when we see something we like, and constrict when we're feeling threatened or uncomfortable.
I've heard that pupillary response is something that's very difficult to control consciously.
It is. It's a purely limbic reaction.
So if someone's pupils suddenly get big when they look at you, it's a pretty good sign they're finding you attractive.
Or at least interesting. But it's just one piece of the puzzle. You have to consider the entire context of the interaction.
Of course. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from hands to feet to torsos to faces. It's amazing how much information our bodies are constantly conveying without us even realizing it.
It really is. And Navarro's work shows us that becoming more aware of these nonverbal cues can be incredibly helpful in both our personal and professional lives.
Yeah, it really is like learning to read people's minds.
Well, not quite, but it's close.
It can definitely help us communicate better, though,
Oh, absolutely.
whether it's at work, in our relationships, or just out in the world.
You know, one thing that struck me about Navarro's work is how much he emphasizes the ethical implications of all this.
Ethical implication.
Yeah. Just because you can read someone's body language
Right.
doesn't mean you know exactly what they're thinking.
Good point.
I mean, we can make educated guesses
Sure.
based on what we observe,
Right.
but you don't want to jump to conclusions.
Definitely not. Body language is just one piece of the puzzle. There's so much more to communication than that.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
what are some key takeaways you hope listeners will remember?
Well, I think the most important thing is just to be aware that our bodies are constantly communicating, even when we're not saying a word.
It's like having a conversation on a whole other level.
Exactly.
And once you start paying attention to those nonverbal cues, you can gain a whole new understanding of the people around you.
And yourself,
And yourself, that's right.
because we all have our own tells.
I know, I'm definitely more aware of my own body language now. After going through all of this material.
It makes you think twice about what you're communicating.
Exactly. So to all you listeners out there, I encourage you to start paying attention to those subtle cues in your everyday interactions.
Yeah, you might be surprised at what you notice.
You might be surprised at how much you've been missing. All right, that's it for our deep dive into the secret language of hands.
Hope you enjoyed it.
We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of human behavior.